Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It has sometimes been observed that if government brings with it the burden of responsibility, a spell in opposition may offer some freedom and flexibility. What's strange in Scotland at the moment is that our political debate is dominated by two major political parties, each with 1 foot in government and 1 foot in opposition. And this in a very difficult circumstance. It may be that we'll have to muddle through without even the glimmer of consensus until at least one of those parties shifts at least 1 foot. There's been much said about the blame that should be allocated for the current economic context, the crisis within which we're currently setting budgets at all levels of government. For myself, I have repeatedly argued that the current context can be placed at the foot of a flawed economic model which has been consistently supported by Labour, Conservative, SNP and Liberal Democrat parties during their various stints in government over the last few decades. I don't really expect to win over the Chamber to that position in a few words today. And in any case, the context is out there. Regardless of different opinions about where to place the blame, we are in this situation. We're left with the same problems to face. Labour respond to those problems with apparently a glowing endorsement of everything in the UK government's budget. I think perhaps we can dismiss that position. The Liberal Democrats, for their part, add that the VAT cut was probably a poor idea. I can support that amendment because it's true. It's unhelpful, but it's true. The government motion highlights the problem simply by restating it. But it leaves me none the wiser as to the response. It leaves me none the wiser than I was 2 years ago about the meaning of what it is to talk about us supporting a sustainable economy. That remains as unclear as it ever has been. The government talks about £500 million of cuts, but still is not able to answer the question, from where will they come? The Conservatives ask us to note the views and analysis of the CPPR, not to endorse them, but to note them, and asks for contingency plans. That seems reasonable. But I think, to be fair, it's already happening. The problem will be if those contingency plans cannot be developed alongside some degree of political consensus. And as I've said already, we don't have the best of possible beginnings for the development of that kind of consensus. As for my own take, the Green take on the context in which the UK government has set its budget is that we're now, I have to say, joined in this analysis by the Sustainable Development Commission, who this week launched their Prosperity Without Growth report, is that the recession, as well as posing serious threats to our well-being, also requires us to re-evaluate what we mean by well-being and prosperity. That would move us away from the GDP fixation from which government at both levels still suffer, and the Conservative amendment appears, I'm afraid, to display the same fixation. There has also been much said at all levels in government about a green stimulus, a Green New Deal, a low-carbon recovery. It's becoming very common language. To compare, the UK, 7% of the fiscal stimulus being directed towards green measures, well below the European average, compares even more poorly with China at 36% and South Korea at over 80%. The consensus appears to be justified that the UK budget is a missed opportunity. In fact, in the words of Friends of the Earth, the government has blown a historic opportunity to turn those words around a green recovery into a reality. Perhaps the clearest symbol of this failure, the car scrappage scheme. Bus manufacturers are going under. Turbine manufacturers are going under. Construction companies stand ready to implement the kind of massive housing retrofit programme to cut energy waste and cut fuel bills. But Mr Mandelson and Mr Darling think it's more important to give people a bung to get more cars onto the road. What's also needing to be talked about is what's missing in the UK budget, as well as what's wrong with what's in there. We need to change the way in which governments set their budgets. A carbon assessment process for budgets would be the first mechanism for placing economic decisions into the proper ecological context. Too often people talk about balancing the environment versus the economy, as though they are two separate parts of an equation. Really what we need to see is that the economy exists within an ecological context, in fact within ecological limits. A carbon assessment process alongside legally binding emission reduction targets will be the first expression of that. Not the last, but the first. How much progress have we had towards that? Well, legislation is in hand to set those targets into place in Scotland. It's already on the books for the UK. The carbon assessment of the budget, we have commitments from Scottish Government ministers gained last year during negotiations, but not a great deal of progress to date. And at UK level, even less progress. Although individual measures in the budget have some degree of carbon assessment, the example I would cite of the measures to support oil extraction appear to say that there will be no carbon impact of that, no climate change impact of that. 2 billion barrels of oil represents 800 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. So while Mike Rumbles talks about a low price of oil, the price may be low for a short while longer, but the cost remains damagingly high. What's necessary within the Scottish Government's motion is some clarity. It implies that the carbon assessment process will be produced alongside the draft budget proposals for 10-11, not when we're past the budget, then to look at it after that. What I need is an explicit commitment of that implicit statement. Will we see that full, rigorous carbon assessment published alongside the draft budget proposals for 2010-11? That would be real progress from the Scottish Government.